In this lecture, we'll be looking at Chapter 5, Amateurs and Academics, a new ideology of femininity in France and England. Now, Chadwick starts the chapter by saying she has three things she wants to show in this chapter. Number one, to show that the reasons for the success of female academians in their own day became the cause of their dismissal by subsequent generations of art historians. Second, to show the ability of these artists to absorb into their persons the qualities which critics sought in representations of women became the most pervasive standard against which to judge their work. And then number three, that women artists, professionals, and amateurs played a role in constructing, manipulating, and reproducing new ideologies of femininity and representation. Now we're looking at the 18th century here. And as long as the woman artist presented a self-image emphasizing beauty, gracefulness, and modesty, and as long as her paintings appeared to conform this construction, she could, albeit with difficulty, negotiate a role for herself in the world of public art. Under the rules of France in the previous century, going from Louis XIV through Louis XVI, which we'll follow through, art was used to help legitimize the power of the king, again showing the divine right of the king. Also, they assumed power over art education and stressed the role of the academies as learned theorists rather than craftsmen or amateur practitioners. By assuming control of artistic education, they controlled style. At the core of the academy program was the course of instruction in life drawing, which was closed to women. They helped establish a hierarchy of genres. We had history painting, then portraiture, then genre, then still life, and landscape. Also ingrained in the multifunctional history and mythological paintings that were important in reinforcing and reducing the power of the court. With Louis XV, we see an aristocratic decorative style with international appeal develop. Instead of an art revolving exclusively around the court, the decorative style, later known as the Rococo, also incorporated the interests of the urban nobility as well as important commercial groups. And I've given you a few examples of Rococo works here. The sumptuous, pleasure-loving art gave visual form to feeling and sensation. Rococo style belonged to a world in which birth determined social status, adultery was accepted as necessary antidote to loveless arranged marriages, and servants and wet nurses relieved upper-class women of many of the burdens of keeping house and nursing infants. And here we see Rosalba Chiari, her date 1675 to 1757, and she was Venetian, however she arrived in Paris in 1720. She was the daughter to a minor Venetian public official and a lace maker. She began her artistic career decorating snuff boxes, and painting miniature portraits on ivory. No woman painter of the century enjoyed as great a success, nor had as much influence on the art of her contemporaries as she did. She played a key role in popularizing the Rococo manner in France and later in England. In fact, George III of England was a major collector of her work. She began to use pastels and also helped to make them famous. And it seems to have been her who introduced the soft fabricated chalks into France. Pastel portraiture formulated an aesthetic of artifice in the early 18th century France, and at whose center was a woman artist. Her loose painterly technique with its subtle surface tonalities and dancing lights revolutionized the medium of pastel. And the first of her many commissions that she had in Paris was to actually paint the 10-year-old King Louis XV. Only in her self-portraits is the superficial flattery demanded by her aristocratic clientele abandoned in favor of probing realism, and we see that in the self-portrait here. Her success in France culminated in her unanimous selection to the Académie Royale in October 1720. By 1682, only 7 women, most of them miniaturists or flower painters, had ever been admitted. Her admission also coincided with a brief period when the freedom, colorfulness, and charm of the Rococo manner dominated the arts. Only when allure took precedence over instruction did artists in France experience some freedom from academic learning. At the time of her year in Paris, learned women were becoming increasingly conspicuous in the public life of the new urban intelligentistas. As leaders of salons, these were learned people would come together to share ideas and talk, right? So as leaders of salons, a social institution which began in the 17th century, a few women were able to satisfy their public ambitions and become purveyors of culture. Some became famous as sites of artistic, philosophical, and intellectual discourse. The salons were an intermediary area between the private sphere of the bourgeoisie family life and the official public sphere of the court. They provided a context in which class distinctions were somewhat relaxed, and artists from middle-class backgrounds could meet upper-class patrons on more or less equal footing. Example, Marie Laur's portrait of Gabrielle Émile Tolaine de Debout, which is the Marquise of Deschelette, 1745-49, is one of a number of paintings by women artists of salonnières and other women intellectuals, evidence of a tradition in which women often represented women. The Marquise was a prodigy who read Locke in the original at 17 and was a respected mathematician, physicist, and philosopher, along as being a famous hostess. This was also the time of François Bouchot, whose paintings are exemplary of the new artistic art which emphasized ornament, tactile sensation, and mutual pleasure rather than ideologies of power defined in terms of gender. By the middle of the century, though, the brief power of the salonnières was being challenged by intellectuals. Although primarily attended by men, the salon signified femininity because of the influence of the women who ran them. The feminine power now attributed to the salonnières was also linked to earlier and widely distrusted court traditions dominated by the image of the father king. And then it's writers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau who viewed the salonnières as a threat to what was considered the natural dominance of men, the salon as a prison in which men were subjected to the rule of women. He rejected a public role for women as speakers. And it is the salonnières' crime to usurp authority, to speak the language of authority, of citizenship, instead of the natural language of family duty. Rousseau stated that when the mistress of the house goes wandering in public, quote, her home is like a lifeless body which is soon corrupted, unquote. The new middle-class ideology depended for its success on the location of affection and sexuality in the family. By containing the female body within the private domestic sphere, this served as a means of controlling female sexuality. The ideal femininity produced through activities like needlework and drawing contributed directly to the consolidation of the bourgeoisie identity in which women had the leisure to cultivate artistic accomplishments. Although the actual circumstances of middle-class women's lives varied widely, the ideology of femininity, which Rousseau and others rationalized as natural to women, was a unifying force in making a class identity. The artistic activities of a growing number of women amateurs working in media like needlework, pastel, and watercolors, and exceedingly highly detailed works on small scale, confirmed Enlightenment views that women had an intellect different from and inferior to that of men. However, though it should also not be understood that this was forced on all women, many women did find both pleasure and fulfillment in these arts. This includes professional women artists who created artworks that helped construct such femininity. The image shown here is Françoise Duparc's A Woman Knitting from late 18th century. All right, now we're going to move to England. In England, as in France, painters had to negotiate between aristocratic and middle-class taste and between amateur and professional classifications. Women continually found their artistic activities equated with their femininity. For women aspiring to history painting and the Academy membership, this unnatural ambition had to be mediated by strict conformity to the social ideology of femininity. English painting in the second quarter of the 18th century reveals both the influence of France and the close relationship between English and French intellectuals. Boarding schools, staffed by impoverished gentlewomen, taught drawing and watercolor to the daughters of upper and middle classes. The publication of drawing manuals, the availability of prints for study, the existence of clean, ready-to-use watercolors, and the taste for picturesque scenery all contributed to the growing numbers of middle and upper-class women in England to take up drawing as a fashionable activity. We have Anne Seymour de Moore, her date 1748 to 1818, was the only woman sculptor of note in England before the 20th century. She received praise for her work, but as a wealthy upper-class woman was considered an eccentric by her friends and was lampooned in the public press for her insolent behavior and aspiring to carve academic nude figures. Here the image shown is her shock dog from circa 1782. Now, women's artistic endeavors were more readily accepted when confined to the feminine media and executed in their own homes, even if the magnitude of their productions challenged what was considered appropriate as feminine accomplishments. So it's going to take us to Angelica Kauffman, her date 1741 to 1807, and she was a professional painter. She's the first woman painter to challenge the masculine monopoly over history painting exercised by the academics. She was the daughter of a minor Swiss ecclesiastical painter, and she spent her youth traveling with her father. She traveled to Italy and met several other artists there. And here we see her Xerxes selecting models for his picture of Helen of Troy, circa 1746. And this suggests both an early awareness of what were then the most popular antique themes among English painters, and a key attentiveness to prevailing social constructions of women and femininity. Her determination to execute large-scale historical works, despite no access to training from the new model, is a mark of her ambition. She arrived in London in 1765 or 1766, and within a year there she had earned enough money painting portraits of aristocratic men and women that she was able to buy a house. This success then enabled her to begin the historical works which, at the time, represented the only route to consideration as a serious artist in England. After an exhibit in 1768, she and the artist West were identified as the initiators of the neoclassical style in England. Her academic success can be attributed to her association with the foremost history painters of her day, and to the fact that she arrived in London after study in Italy that was expected of all serious painters in oils at a key moment. The reasons for her enormous popular and professional following, though, are more complex. By modern art historians, she has been dismissed for an inability to, quote, achieve much Roman gravity, unquote, and the works of her contemporaries are praised for being full-blooded in comparison. Her relative lack of training in drawing, over which she had little control, has been used to prove the inferiority of her work and to that of her male contemporaries. The romanticizing of her that spread her legend to a general population through engravings also, no doubt, encouraged later writers to dismiss her as charming but inconsequential. Ironically, in her own time, it was her public status and historical commissions that were the focus of 18th century attacks on her. Much satire directed against women artists at the time coincided with their efforts to enter the field of history painting. According to the ideologies of an expanding middle class, women were assigned to the domestic sphere and labeled as being inclined toward irrationality. Confronting such definitions directly risked marginalization. Attacks such as those on Kauffman mount in direct proportion to the public stature of women artists and cannot be separated from the charge that by taking up a public activity, women either unsexes herself or, in this case, unsexes men. Similar problems confronted academic women painters in France. We see the portraits of Vigée Lebrun and of La Brigiarde reveal that both painters sometimes manipulated their brushstrokes to emphasize gender differences. The brusque, taut surfaces and intense gazes of the male sitters in Vigée Lebrun's paintings are almost entirely missing from her portraits of women. The three women painters working under royal patronage in France during the 1770s and 1780s were never far from critical responses conflating the woman in the work. The paintings they executed in the years before the French Revolution reveal the awkwardness of negotiating between competing ideologies of increasingly incomparable goals. The royal family with its aristocratic followers and expectations that art should flatter, and the middle class with its growing demand for paintings of moral virtue. The Paris in which these women worked was that of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. During the 1760s, increasingly middle-class audiences demanded an art of moralizing sentiment rather than the grand public narrative and historical paintings that had characterized earlier salons. The desire for art that conformed contemporary moral values dominated criticism at the mid-century. And this is where we're going to see the artist Anna Vollert-Coster. She was patronized by both the court and by wealthy bankers and merchants who were drawn to the modest themes and carefully crafted surfaces of her still lifes. Her marriage to a wealthy lawyer and a member of parliament in 1781 ensured her social standing. She was trained by her father, who was the king's goldsmith, and a tapestry designer before establishing his studio in Paris in 1754. Her works, which were models of simplicity, order, and crisp realism, make only a few concessions to a middle-class taste increasingly drawn to Chardin's rustic kitchen interiors with their copper and enamel wares. Now we're going to move to Elisabeth Louis Vigée-Lebrun. She acquired most of her artistic training independently and was actually largely self-taught. She, like many women, was barred from the study of the live new model. Her first portraits were members of her own family, but her marriage to Jean-Baptiste Pierre Lebrun, who was an artist, restorer, critic, and dealer, established her as a major figure in the social life of aristocratic urban Paris. Now, what's interesting is critics would often note a so-called rivalry between Vigée-Lebrun and the artist Lebrun-Gerard. Their first appearance together, and here you have them both here in the image, the first appearance together as academics took place in the Salon of the Académie Royale in 1783. And what we mean by the salon now was not the salons in the homes, but salon was the formal show of artwork. It was then that the critics previously content to facilitate between the two women unequivocally took sides. They called them fierce rivals, but their work differed in style. The artificial rivalry thrust on them enabled critics to give voice to accusations that reminded audience that famous or infamous public women such as these had exceeded their natural domain. The rivalry preserved the separation of men and women. By comparing two successful women artists almost exclusively to one another, it became unnecessary to evaluate their work in relation to that of their male contemporaries or to abandon rigid identifications between female painters and their imagery. In the second half of the century, there was a wide range of new family images. Only women whose labor was entirely domestic could properly attend to the needs of the liberated baby. And here we see the artist Adelaide Lebrun-Gerard. And this is her pastel portrait of Madame Métis and her children from 1783. And this is the first of her works reflecting the new ideology of the bourgeoisie family. The middle-class counterpart of dedicated motherhood in her work can be found in her work Homework, which is a small oval painting in which a young mother, very simply attired, instructs the female child who crouches at her knee. The cult of blissful motherhood was one of the most obvious expressions in the representation of the new and evolving ideology of the family. It began to be conveyed as a social unit in which individuals could find happiness as husbands and wives, fathers and mothers. The ideology of the happy family was, however, riddled with contradictions. Laws depriving women of all rights over property and person accompanied the eulogizing of marriage as a loving partnership. As birth rates dropped in the 18th century, with the first widespread use of birth control, children became more precious and campaigns to change child-rearing practices began. As a result of her success in the Salon, again, the annual show, Vigée-Lebrun received the commission for her portrait of Marie Antoinette with her children in 1787, which you see on the left. This was a monumental work of political propaganda, which has been called one of the great works of the 18th century political painting and the last serious attempt to revive the Queen's reputation. The painting was commissioned from her before the Salon of 1785 had closed its doors for the colossal price of over 18,000 livres. She based the pyramid composition on the triangular configurations of certain high Renaissance Holy Families. Here, Marie is dressed in a simple robe surrounded by her children. The monumental and imposing image of the Mater Familias is softened by the presence of the children grouped around her, her son pointing at the empty cradle, which commemorates a recently deceased daughter, her older daughter leaning affectionately against the royal arm. The grouping of children around Marie Antoinette emphasizes the central role of women in the generational reproduction of class power at the same time that it points towards the new ideology of the loving family. However, by the time of the 1787 Salon had opened, the political situation in France had deteriorated. Critical ambivalence about the work centered around the impossibility of resolving two different ethoses: the divine right of kings transferred from the image of the Pater Familias to the figure as Marie Antoinette as queen, and the new bourgeoisie ideal of happy motherhood. It was widely contrasted with the universally popular image of motherhood presented in the same salon in Vigée Lebrun's self-portrait with her daughter Julie, which you see on the right here. The touching image of young motherhood perfectly illustrates the contradictions between idealized representation and lived experience. The Salon of 1785 also included David's The Oath of the Horatii from 1785. The severity and rationality of David's neoclassicalism and his themes of patriotic virtue and male heroism are important forerunners of the political and social upheavals of the next decade. The presentation of a world in which sexual difference is carefully affirmed here. There are clear distinctions drawn between the male figures, who are erected and with muscles tense swear allegiance with drawn swords, and the female figures who swoon and weep. The entire composition reinforces the work's separation into male and female spheres. By 1789, the conflict between radical republicanism and social conservatism in France was fully evident. Vigée Lebrun enjoyed unanimous critical acclaim, but her personal reputation had been destroyed by malicious rumors about an alleged affair with the exiled finance minister Carlon. She left France with her daughter for what would become a 12-year exile. The attacks on prominent public women reveal the fears of the revolutionaries that women, if allowed to enter the public realm, would become not women but hideous perversions of female sexuality. Debates over the political rights of women raged during these early years of social unrest. During the next 2 years, the situation of women artists, though, would change dramatically. The recognition of the Académie Royale won for women the right to exhibit at the Salon, but the free art training offered at the École des Beaux-Arts remained closed to them, as did the right to compete for the prestigious Prize of Rome. The opening of the Salon to women proved decisive, and in the years after the Revolution, large numbers of women exhibited. However, it is David's heroic brotherhood that came to emphasize the new republic. Again, despite attempts to restrain the activities of women artists made progress in the years after the French Revolution. Less restricted access to the Salon and a loosening of the dominance of historical and mythological painting led to an increasing representation of women in Salon exhibits. In fact, in the Salon of 1801, 14.6% of the artists were women, and then in the 1836 Salon, the percentage of women artists was actually 22.2%. So still a minor number, but a great increase within a matter of years.